In the Western world, nothing is safe from being commodified. It is here where another prevailing monopoly exists. There are a select few groups and corporations that own the majority of enterprises and entities, extending their dominance even to the field of substance abuse treatment, where Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, has gained prominence in the mainstream treatment system. Despite assertions made by AA regarding its unique efficacy, it still yields a mere 7 to 10% success rate due to many misleading claims. Meanwhile, other alternative treatments are demonstrably more effective than AA yet remain unknown in the substance abuse treatment industry. When an addict enters the rooms of AA, he or she feels utterly defeated. And according to AA doctrine, that failure is yours alone. When the 12 steps don't work for someone, Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't hold the individual responsible, but instead they tell him he is deeply flawed. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous states, "Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. This is read at the beginning of every meeting. The instruction comes from How It Works, the 5th chapter of the Big Book. Upon hearing this, an addict's despair only heightens at his seemingly lack of options after AA claims to be the only solution." The 12 steps are so deeply ingrained in the United States that many people, including doctors and therapists, believe attending meetings, earning sobriety chips, and never taking another sip of alcohol is the only way to get better. Hospitals, outpatient clinics, and rehab centers use the 12 steps as the basis for treatment. Doctors have a hard time understanding that there is no one-size-fits-all treatment for addicts, or anything for that matter. Despite this, there are alternatives, including prescription drugs, therapies, and realistic programs that aim to help patients become abstinent or learn to drink in moderation. Unlike Alcoholics Anonymous, these methods are based on modern science and have been proven in randomized controlled studies to work. However, it has gained newfound significance following the enactment of the Affordable Care Act. This legislation mandates that all insurers and state Medicaid programs cover alcohol and substance abuse treatment, thereby extending coverage to 32 million previously uninsured Americans and offering enhanced coverage to an additional 30 million individuals. In the realm of medicine, few treatments are as inadequately supported by modern scientific evidence as those for addiction. A 2012 report by the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University drew parallels between the current state of addiction medicine and the early 1900s era of general medicine when unqualified practitioners operated alongside formally trained physicians. According to the American Medical Association, out of 1 million physicians in the United States, only 582 identified themselves as addiction specialists. It is worth noting, as highlighted in the Columbia report, that there may be additional physicians with a subspecialty in addiction. The majority of treatment providers hold credentials as addiction counselors or substance abuse counselors, for which many states impose minimal educational requirements, such as a high school diploma or a GED. Furthermore, many counselors are individuals in recovery themselves, a topic that will be explored further. The report stated, "The vast majority of people in need of addiction treatment do not receive anything that approximates evidence-based care." Alcoholics Anonymous was established in 1935 when knowledge of the brain was in its infancy. It offers a single path to recovery: lifelong abstinence from alcohol. The program instructs members to surrender their ego, Accept that they are powerless over alcohol. Make amends to those they've wronged and pray and meditate, much like a religion or cult. Alcoholics Anonymous is famously difficult to keep tabs on, in that it keeps no records of who attends meetings. Members come and go, and of course remain anonymous. So if a judge orders you to attend AA meetings, any forged signature will do, and the judge will be none the wiser. No conclusive data exists on how well the program works. In 2006, the Cochrane Collaboration, a healthcare research group, reviewed studies going back to the 1960s and found that no experimental studies unequivocally demonstrated the effectiveness of AA or 12-step approaches for reducing alcohol dependence or problems. The Big Book includes an assertion first made in the second edition, which was published in 1955, that AA has worked for 75% of people who have gone to meetings and really tried. It says that 50% got sober right away, and another 25% struggled for a while but eventually recovered. I'll say it again, due to its anonymity, there can't be any conclusive evidence. According to AA, these figures are based on members' experiences. In his book, The Sober Truth: Debunking the Bad Science Behind 12-Step Programs and the Rehab Industry, Lance Dodds, a retired psychiatry professor from Harvard Medical School, looked at Alcoholics Anonymous's retention rates, along with studies on sobriety and rates of active involvement, attending meetings regularly and working the program among AA members. Based on his data, he put AA's actual success rate somewhere between 5 and 8%. That is just a rough estimate, but it's the most precise one you will find. We've grown so accustomed to testimonials from those who say AA saved their life that we take the program's efficacy as an article of faith. Rarely do we hear from those for whom 12-step treatment doesn't work. But think about it. How many celebrities can you name who bounced in and out of rehab without ever getting better? Why do we assume they failed the program, rather than the program had failed them? Amy Lee Coy, the author of the memoir From Death Do I Part, How I Freed Myself from Addiction, told about her 8 trips to rehab, starting at age 13. It's like getting the same antibiotic for a resistant infection 8 times. So, how exactly did AA start? In 1934, just after Prohibition's repeal, a failed stockbroker named Bill Wilson staggered into a Manhattan hospital. Wilson was known to drink 2 quarts of whiskey a day, a habit he'd attempted to kick many times. He was given the hallucinogen belladonna, an experimental treatment for addictions, and from his hospital bed he called out to God to loosen alcohol's grip. He reported seeing a flash of light and feeling a serenity he had never before experienced. He quit booze for good. The next year, he co-founded Alcoholics Anonymous. He based its principles on the beliefs of the evangelical Oxford group, which taught that people were sinners who through confession and God's help could right their paths. AA filled a vacuum in the medical world, which at the time had few answers for heavy drinkers. In 1956, the American Medical Association named alcoholism a disease, but doctors continued to offer little beyond the standard treatment that had been around for decades: detoxification in state psychiatric wards or private sanatoriums. As Alcoholics Anonymous grew, hospitals began creating alcoholism wards, where patients detoxed but were given no other medical treatment. Instead, AA members, who as part of the 12 steps pledged to help other alcoholics, appeared at bedsides and invited the newly sober to meetings. A public relations specialist and early AA member named Marty Mann worked to disseminate the group's main tenet, that alcoholics had an illness that rendered them powerless over booze. Their drinking was a disease, in other words, not a moral failing. Paradoxically, the prescription for this medical condition was a set of spiritual steps that required accepting a higher power, taking a fearless moral inventory, admitting the exact nature of our wrongs, and asking God to remove all character defects. Mann helped ensure that these ideas made their way to Hollywood. In 1945's The Lost Weekend, a struggling novelist tries to loosen his writer's block with booze, to devastating effect. In Days of Wine and Roses, released in 1962, Jack Lemmon slides into alcoholism along with his wife, played by Lee Remick. He finds help through AA, but she rejects the group and loses her family. Mann also collaborated with a physiologist named E.M. Jelinek. Mann was eager to bolster the scientific claims behind AA, and Jelinek wanted to make a name for himself in the growing field of alcohol research. In 1946, Jelinek published the results of a survey mailed to 1,600 AA members. Only 158 were returned. Jelinek and Mann jettisoned 45 that had been improperly completed, and another 15 filled out by women, whose responses were so unlike the men's that they risked complicating the results. From this small sample, 98 men, Jelinek drew sweeping conclusions about the phases of alcoholism, which included an unavoidable succession of binges that led to blackouts, indefinable fears, and hitting bottom. Though the paper was filled with caveats about its lack of scientific rigor, it became AA gospel. Jelinek, however, later tried to distance himself from this work and from Alcoholics Anonymous. His ideas came to be illustrated by a chart showing how alcoholics progressed from occasionally drinking for relief to sneaking drinks to guilt and so on, until they hit bottom and then recovered. In 1952, Jelinek noted that the word alcoholic had been adopted to describe anyone who drank excessively. He warned that overuse of that word would undermine the disease concept. He later beseeched AA to stay out of the way of scientists trying to do objective research, but AA supporters worked to make sure their approach remained central. Marty Mann joined prominent Americans including Susan Anthony, the grandniece of Susan B. Anthony, Jan Clayton, the mom from Lassie, and decorated military officers in testifying before Congress. John D. Rockefeller Jr., a lifelong non-drinker, was an early booster of the group, along with the eugenics movement and other Malthusian efforts. In 1970, Senator Harold Hughes of Iowa, a member of AA, persuaded Congress to pass the Comprehensive Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism Prevention, Treatment, and Rehabilitation Act. It called for the establishment of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism and dedicated funding for the study and treatment of alcoholism. The NIAAA, in turn, funded Marty Mann's nonprofit advocacy group, the National Council on Alcoholism, to educate the public. The nonprofit became a mouthpiece for AA's beliefs, especially the importance of abstinence, and has at times worked to squash research that challenged those beliefs. In 1976, for instance, the RAND Corporation released a study of more than 2,000 men who had been patients at 44 different NIAAA-funded treatment centers. The report noted that 18 months after treatment, 22% of the men were drinking moderately. The authors concluded that some alcohol-dependent men could return to controlled drinking. Researchers at the National Council on Alcoholism charged that the news would lead alcoholics to falsely believe they could drink safely. If Betty Ford and Elizabeth Taylor could declare that they were alcoholics and seek help, so too could ordinary people who struggled with drinking. The NIAAA, which had funded the research, repudiated it. RAND repeated the study, this time looking over 4 years. The results were similar. After the Hughes Act was passed, insurers began to recognize alcoholism as a disease and pay for treatment. For-profit rehab facilities sprouted across the country, the beginnings of what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Hughes became a treatment entrepreneur himself after retiring from the Senate. Today there are more than 13,000 rehab facilities in the United States, and about 90% of them follow the 12 steps. The problem is that nothing about the 12-step approach draws on modern science, not the character building, not the tough love, not even the standard 28-day rehab stay. Marvin D. Sapala, the chief medical officer at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation in Minnesota, one of the oldest inpatient rehab facilities in the country, describes how 28 days became the norm. In 1949, the founders found that it took about a week to get detoxed, another week to come around, so the patients knew what they were up to, and after a couple of weeks they were doing well and stable. That's how it turned out to be 28 days. There's no magic in it. Tom McClellan, a psychology professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine who has served as a deputy U.S. drug czar and is an advisor to the World Health Organization, says that while AA and other programs that focus on behavioral change have value, they don't address what we now know about the biology of drinking. Alcohol acts on many parts of the brain, making it in some ways more complex than drugs like cocaine and heroin, which target just one area of the brain. Among other effects, alcohol increases the amount of GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, a chemical that slows down activity in the nervous system and decreases the flow of glutamate, which activates the nervous system. This is why drinking can make you relax, shed inhibitions, and forget your worries. Alcohol also prompts the brain to release dopamine, a chemical associated with pleasure. Over time, though, the brain of a heavy drinker adjusts to the steady flow of alcohol by producing less GABA and more glutamate, resulting in anxiety and irritability. Dopamine production also slows, and the person gets less pleasure out of everyday things. Combined, these changes gradually bring about a crucial shift. Instead of drinking to feel good, the person ends up drinking to avoid feeling bad. Alcohol also damages the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for judging risks and regulating behavior. One reason some people keep drinking even as they realize that the habit is destroying their lives. The good news is that the damage can be undone if they're able to get their consumption under control. Studies of twins and adopted children suggest that about half of a person's vulnerability to alcohol use disorder is hereditary, and that anxiety, depression, and environment, all considered outside issues by many in Alcoholics Anonymous and the rehab industry, also play a role. Still, science can't yet fully explain why some heavy drinkers become physiologically dependent on alcohol and others don't, or why some recover while others flounder. We don't know how much drinking it takes to cause major changes in the brain, or whether the brains of alcohol-dependent people are in some ways different from normal brains to begin with. What we do know, McClellan says, is that the brains of the alcohol-addicted aren't like those of the non-alcohol dependent. "80 years ago, Bill Wilson, AA's founding father, had insisted that alcohol dependence is an illness, not a moral failing. Why then do we so rarely treat it medically? It's a question that's been asked many times by researchers and clinicians. Alcohol and substance use disorders are the realm of medicine, McClellan says. This is not the realm of priests. As the rehab industry began expanding in the 1970s, its profit motives dovetailed nicely with Alcoholics Anonymous's view that counseling could be delivered by people who had themselves struggled with addiction, rather than by highly trained and highly paid doctors and mental health professionals. No other area of medicine or counseling makes such allowances. There is no mandatory national certification exam for addiction counselors. The 2012 Columbia University Report on Addiction Medicine found that only 6 states required alcohol and substance abuse counselors to have at least a bachelor's degree, and that only 1 state, Vermont, required a master's degree. 14 states had no license requirements whatsoever. Not even a GED or an introductory training course was necessary. And yet counselors are often called on by the judicial system and medical boards to give expert opinions on their clients' prospects for recovery. Perhaps even worse is the pace of research on drugs to treat alcohol use disorders. The FDA has approved just 3 Antabuse, the drug that induces nausea and dizziness when taken with alcohol, acamprosate, which is helpful in quelling cravings, and naltrexone. There is also Vivitrol, the injectable form of naltrexone. There has been some progress. The Hazelden Center began prescribing naltrexone and acamprosate to patients in 2003. This makes Hazelden a pioneer among rehab centers. There was never any campaign for this medication that said, "Ask your doctor," nor was there ever any attempt to reach consumers. Few doctors accepted that it was possible to treat alcohol use disorder with a pill, and now that naltrexone is available in an inexpensive generic form, pharmaceutical companies have little incentive to promote it. In one study, naltrexone was found to be effective in limiting consumption among college-age drinkers. The drug helps subjects keep from going over the legal threshold for intoxication, a blood alcohol content of 0.08%. Moderate drinking is not a possibility for every patient, and doctors should weigh many factors when deciding whether to recommend lifelong abstinence. It is unlikely for a doctor to consider moderation as a goal for patients with severe alcohol use disorder. According to the DSM-5, patients in the severe range have 6 or more symptoms of the disorder, such as frequently drinking more than intended, increased tolerance, unsuccessful attempts to cut back, cravings, missing obligations due to drinking, and continuing to drink despite negative personal or social consequences. Other factors to be taken into account are whether the patient has mood, anxiety, or personality disorders, chronic pain, or a lack of social support. Doctors then can provide treatment based on the stage where patients are, which is a radical departure from issuing the same prescription to everyone. The difficulty of determining which patients are good candidates for moderation is an important cautionary note. However, promoting abstinence as the only valid goal of treatment likely deters people with mild or moderate alcohol use disorder from seeking help. The prospect of never taking another sip is daunting, to say the least. It comes with social costs and may even be worse for one's health than moderate drinking. Research has found that having a drink or two a day could reduce the risk of heart disease, dementia, and diabetes. We cling to this one-size-fits-all theory even when a person has a small problem. The idea is, well, this may be the person you are now, but this is where this is going, and there's only one way to fix it. In reality, however, we have 50 years of research saying that chances are that's not the way it's going. We can change the course.